Jake Morrison woke up before the sun came up, just like he did every day. His small wooden cabin sat alone in a wide valley in Montana Territory. The year was 1876, and Jake liked being alone. He had chosen this empty place on purpose. The cabin was simple but strong. Jake had built it himself 3 years ago when he first came to this valley. It had thick log walls, a stone fireplace, and 2 small windows. One window faced east to catch the morning sun. The other looked west toward the mountains. Jake had made the furniture too: a wooden table, 2 chairs, and a bed. Everything was plain but useful. Outside, his horse Buck stood in a small fence area near the cabin. Buck was a brown horse with white spots on his nose. The horse had been with Jake for 5 years, through good times and bad. Next to Buck's area was a larger fence where Jake kept his 12 cattle. They were not fancy cattle, but they were healthy and strong. Jake got dressed in his usual clothes: brown pants, a blue shirt, and leather boots. He put on his old army jacket even though he was not a soldier anymore. The jacket was torn in some places, but it kept him warm in the cold mountain air. He always wore his hat too. It was brown and worn out, but it kept the sun off his face. The first thing Jake did every morning was check on Buck and the cattle. He walked outside and felt the cold air hit his face. Fall was coming to the mountains. The leaves on the trees were turning yellow and red. Soon it would be winter, and Jake needed to get ready. Buck made a soft noise when he saw Jake coming. Jake patted the horse's neck and gave him some hay. The cattle were standing together near the fence. They looked at Jake with their big brown eyes, waiting for their food. Jake counted them like he did every day: 12 cattle, all there and all healthy. After feeding the animals, Jake went back inside to make breakfast. He cooked eggs from his chickens and made coffee in a metal pot. He ate slowly while looking out the window at the mountains. The peaks were covered with snow even though it was only fall. Winter came early and stayed late in this part of Montana. Jake had come to this valley to get away from people. Before this, he had been a soldier in the army. He had fought in battles and seen terrible things. When the war ended, Jake did not want to live in towns anymore. He did not want to be around crowds of people. He wanted quiet and peace. Most people thought Jake was strange for living alone so far from town. The nearest town was Willow Creek, and it was 2 days away by horse. Jake only went there when he really needed something he could not make or grow himself. Even then, he did not stay long. He would buy what he needed and leave quickly. The people in Willow Creek knew Jake but did not really know him. They called him the quiet cowboy or the mountain man. Some people said he was unfriendly. Others said he was dangerous because he had been a soldier. Jake did not care what they said. He just wanted to be left alone. Jake spent his days taking care of his animals and his land. He fixed fences when they broke. He cut wood for his fireplace. He hunted deer and rabbits for meat. He grew vegetables in a small garden behind his cabin. In summer, he picked berries in the forest. Jake could take care of himself without help from anyone. The valley where Jake lived was beautiful but dangerous. There were wild animals like bears, wolves, and mountain cats. The weather could change fast. A sunny day could turn into a bad storm in just a few hours. In winter, the snow could be so deep that Jake could not leave his cabin for weeks. Jake was not afraid of the dangers. He had his rifle and he knew how to use it. He had learned to read the weather by watching the clouds and feeling the wind. He always kept plenty of food and wood stored in his cabin for the long winter months. Sometimes Jake felt lonely, but he told himself he liked being alone. At night, he would sit by his fireplace and read old books by the light of the fire. He had about 20 books that he had brought from his old life. He read them over and over again. Sometimes he wrote in a journal about his day, but most days were the same, so there was not much to write. The Native American tribes in the area knew about Jake too. The Blackfoot people had hunting grounds near his valley. Sometimes Jake would see smoke from their fires in the distance. Once or twice he had seen riders on the hills watching him. But they never came close, and Jake never went looking for them. Jake had heard stories in town about fights between settlers and native tribes. People in Willow Creek were scared and angry. They said the tribes were dangerous and wanted to hurt white people. Jake did not know if the stories were true. He had never had trouble with any native people. He minded his own business and they minded theirs. The truth was that Jake respected the native tribes. He knew they had lived in these mountains long before any white people came. He was just one man living quietly in their land. He tried not to bother them and hoped they would not bother him. As fall went on, Jake worked hard to get ready for winter. He cut more wood and stacked it next to his cabin. He fixed small holes in his roof. He checked his supplies of flour, beans, and coffee. He cleaned his rifle and counted his bullets. By the time the first snow came, Jake would be ready. Most evenings, Jake would stand outside his cabin and look at the stars. The sky was so clear in the mountains that he could see thousands of stars. The air was quiet except for the sounds of wind in the trees and animals moving in the forest. This was the life Jake had chosen, and most of the time he was happy with it. But Jake did not know that his quiet life was about to change forever. Tomorrow would bring something that would test everything he believed about right and wrong. Tomorrow he would have to make a choice that would change his life and the lives of many other people. But tonight, Jake Morrison went to sleep in his simple cabin, thinking tomorrow would be just like every other day. Jake woke up early as always, but something felt different about this morning. The air was colder than yesterday, and frost covered the grass around his cabin. He could see his breath when he stepped outside to check on Buck and the cattle. Winter was coming fast this year. After feeding his animals and eating breakfast, Jake decided to ride out and check his fence lines. The fence on the north side of his property ran along the edge of the pine forest. Sometimes bears or other animals knocked down parts of the fence trying to get to his cattle. Jake needed to make sure everything was strong before the heavy snows came. Jake put his rifle in the leather holder on his saddle and climbed onto Buck's back. The horse was eager to move after standing in the small fence area all night. They rode north toward the dark line of pine trees that covered the mountainside. The morning sun felt good on Jake's back, but he could tell it would not be a warm day. The fence looked good for the first mile. Jake had built it strong with thick wooden posts and heavy wire. He stopped every few hundred feet to check the posts and make sure the wire was tight. Buck walked slowly and calmly, used to this kind of work. When they reached the place where the fence turned east toward the rocky hills, Jake heard something that made him stop. It was a sound that did not belong in the quiet forest. At first he thought it might be a bird, but then he heard it again. It was a scream. A human scream. Jake pulled Buck to a stop and listened carefully. The sound came again, high and full of fear. It was coming from somewhere in the pine trees ahead of them. Jake's heart started beating faster. In 3 years of living in this valley, he had never heard anything like this. The scream came again, and this time Jake was sure. It was a child screaming for help. Jake did not think long about what to do. He turned Buck toward the sound and pushed the horse into the trees. The pine forest was thick and dark. Branches hit Jake's face and caught on his jacket as Buck pushed through the trees. Jake followed the screaming, which was getting louder and more desperate. After riding hard for several minutes, Jake came to a small clearing where the trees opened up. On the far side of the clearing was a pile of big rocks like a small mountain made of stone. The rocks were about 20 feet high and very steep. At the top of the rocks, Jake could see a small figure. It was a child, and the child was in terrible danger. The boy looked to be about 8 years old. He had long black hair and was wearing clothes that Jake recognized as Native American. The child was holding onto the rocks with both hands, trying not to fall. His face was white with fear, and tears ran down his cheeks as he screamed for help. But what made Jake's blood turn cold was what he saw at the bottom of the rocks. A huge grizzly bear was walking back and forth below the child. The bear was bigger than any Jake had ever seen. It must have weighed more than 500 pounds. Its fur was dark brown and thick. When it stood up on its back legs to try to reach the child, it was almost tall enough to touch the boy's feet. Jake quickly understood what had happened. The child had been picking berries or gathering nuts in the forest when he surprised the bear. Bears were very dangerous when they were surprised, especially if they had babies nearby. The boy had climbed up on the rocks to get away, but now he was trapped. The bear would not leave, and the child could not hold on much longer. The bear saw Jake and Buck come into the clearing. It dropped down to all 4 legs and turned to face them. The animal's small dark eyes were angry and dangerous. It made a low growling sound that Jake could feel in his chest. This bear was not going to run away. Jake's mind raced as he tried to think of what to do. He could turn around and ride away. The child was not his problem. Jake had come to these mountains to get away from other people's troubles. The smart thing to do would be to leave and pretend he had never seen anything. But as Jake looked at the terrified child clinging to the rocks, he knew he could not ride away. The boy was just a little kid scared and alone. It did not matter that he was Native American and Jake was white. It did not matter that their people were often enemies. What mattered was that a child was about to die, and Jake was the only person who could help. The bear roared at Jake and Buck. The sound was so loud it echoed off the rocks and through the trees. Buck tried to back away, but Jake held him steady. The horse was scared, but he trusted Jake and would do what his rider asked. Jake slowly reached for his rifle. He had to be very careful. If he moved too fast, the bear might attack. If he missed his shot, the bear would definitely attack. And even if he hit the bear, a wounded grizzly was more dangerous than a healthy one. The child saw Jake and cried out in a language Jake did not understand. The boy was reaching one hand toward Jake while holding on to the rocks with the other. Jake could see that the child's arms were shaking from fear and tiredness. The boy could not hold on much longer. The bear was getting more angry. It charged a few steps toward Jake, then stopped. It was trying to decide if Jake was a threat. Jake knew that bears usually tried to scare enemies away before they attacked. But this bear had babies somewhere nearby, Jake was sure of it. A mother bear protecting her cubs would fight to the death. Jake raised his rifle slowly and carefully. He aimed at the bear's chest, right behind the front leg where the heart would be. At this distance, about 30 feet, Jake was confident he could hit what he aimed at. But grizzly bears were incredibly tough. Even a good shot might not stop the animal before it could attack. The bear saw the rifle and stood up on its back legs again. Standing up, it was taller than Jake sitting on his horse. The animal's huge paws had claws as long as Jake's fingers. One swipe from those claws could kill a man instantly. For a long moment, man and bear stared at each other. The child continued to cry and call for help. Buck stood perfectly still, waiting to see what would happen. Jake's finger was on the trigger of his rifle, ready to shoot. Then something unexpected happened. From somewhere in the forest behind the bear, Jake heard a small sound. It was the sound of baby bears playing. The mother bear heard it too. She looked back toward the sound, then looked at Jake again. Jake realized this was his chance. While the bear was distracted, he could try to scare it away instead of shooting it. Very slowly, Jake moved his rifle to point at the sky instead of at the bear. Then he fired one shot into the air. The sound of the gunshot was incredibly loud in the quiet forest. Birds flew out of the trees and small animals ran in all directions. The bear dropped to all four legs and looked around in confusion and fear. Jake quickly loaded another bullet into his rifle and fired again into the air. The second shot was too much for the bear. She turned and ran into the trees toward the sound of her cubs. In just a few seconds, the huge animal disappeared into the forest. Jake and the child were alone in the clearing. The immediate danger was over, but Jake's work was not finished. He still had to get the boy down from the rocks safely. After the bear disappeared into the forest, Jake sat on Buck for a moment, listening carefully. His heart was still beating fast from the danger. He wanted to make sure the bear was really gone and not just hiding in the trees nearby. The forest was quiet now except for the child's soft crying from the top of the rocks. Jake looked up at the boy and saw that the child was in a very bad situation. The rocks were steep and smooth with very few places to hold on. The boy had managed to climb up when he was running from the bear, but getting down would be much harder. His small hands were shaking from fear and cold, and Jake could see that he was getting tired. Jake got down from Buck and tied the horse's rope to a tree. He did not want Buck to run away if the bear came back. Then Jake walked closer to the pile of rocks and looked up at the child. The boy was about 8 years old with long black hair tied back with a leather string. He wore a shirt and pants made of soft animal skin, decorated with small beads in blue and red colors. His feet had leather shoes that looked warm and comfortable. This was clearly a Native American child, probably from the Blackfoot tribe that lived in these mountains. Jake tried to speak to the boy, but he did not know any native languages. "Hello," Jake called up. "Can you understand me?" The child looked down at Jake with big dark eyes full of fear. He said something in his own language, but Jake could not understand the words. The boy's voice sounded very scared and tired. Jake pointed to himself and said slowly, "Jake, my name is Jake." Then he pointed up at the boy and tried to look friendly. "What is your name?" The child seemed to understand that Jake was trying to help. He pointed to himself and said something that sounded like Little Wolf, but in his own language. Jake nodded and smiled to show that he understood. "Little Wolf," Jake repeated, trying to say the name the way the boy had said it. The child's face showed a little bit of hope when he heard Jake use his name. Now Jake had to figure out how to get Little Wolf down from the rocks safely. The rocks were too high and steep for the boy to climb down by himself. If he fell, he could be badly hurt or killed, but the rocks were also too high for Jake to reach the boy just by standing at the bottom. Jake looked around the clearing and saw a dead tree that had fallen down. The tree was long enough and strong enough to help. Jake dragged the heavy tree over to the rocks and leaned it against the stone pile. Now he had a way to climb up closer to Little Wolf, but before Jake climbed up, he needed to make sure the bear was not coming back. He walked around the clearing with his rifle ready, looking for any signs that the big animal was still nearby. He found bear tracks in the soft dirt, and he found the place where Little Wolf had been picking berries before the bear surprised him. Jake also found something that worried him. There were more bear tracks, smaller ones. These were the tracks of baby bears. The mother bear had not been alone. She had 2 cubs with her, and they were somewhere in the forest nearby. This meant the mother bear would not go far away. She would stay close to protect her babies. Jake knew he had to work fast. The mother bear might come back at any time, especially if she heard noise from the clearing. And Little Wolf was getting weaker every minute. The boy's hands were starting to slip on the smooth rocks. Jake checked his rifle to make sure it was loaded. Then he started climbing up the fallen tree toward Little Wolf. The tree was slippery and hard to climb, but Jake had strong hands from years of ranch work. He climbed slowly and carefully, talking to Little Wolf the whole time. "I'm coming to help you," Jake said in a calm voice. "Do not be afraid. I will get you down safely." Little Wolf watched Jake climb up toward him. The boy's face was still scared, but Jake could see hope in his eyes too. When Jake got close enough, he reached out his hand toward Little Wolf. "Take my hand," Jake said. "I will help you." Little Wolf was afraid to let go of the rocks, but he could see that Jake was trying to help him. Very slowly, the boy reached out one small hand toward Jake. Their fingers touched, and Jake felt how cold and shaky the child's hand was. "Good," Jake said. "Now give me your other hand too." This was the most dangerous part. Little Wolf had to let go of the rocks completely and trust Jake to keep him safe. The boy looked into Jake's eyes for a long moment, trying to decide if he could trust this stranger. Then very carefully, Little Wolf let go of the rocks and grabbed Jake's hands with both of his. Jake felt the full weight of the child as he pulled Little Wolf toward him. The boy was light, but Jake had to be very careful not to lose his balance on the slippery tree. Slowly, Jake helped Little Wolf get onto the tree trunk where they could both hold on. "You are safe now," Jake told the boy. "We will climb down together." But just as they started to climb down, Jake heard a sound that made his blood turn cold. It was the sound of branches breaking in the forest nearby. Something big was moving through the trees toward the clearing. The mother bear was coming back. Jake looked down at the ground, then looked at Little Wolf. They were still 15 feet above the rocky ground, too high to jump safely. But they did not have time to climb down slowly. Jake could hear the bear getting closer. Jake made a quick decision. He picked up Little Wolf and held the boy tight against his chest. "Hold on to me very tight," Jake told him. "Do not let go." Little Wolf wrapped his arms around Jake's neck and held on as tight as he could. Jake could feel the boy shaking with fear, but the child trusted him. Jake half climbed, half slid down the tree as fast as he could. When they were still 8 feet from the ground, Jake heard the bear break into the clearing behind them. There was no time to climb down the rest of the way. Jake jumped. They hit the ground hard, and Jake rolled to protect Little Wolf from the impact. Pain shot through Jake's left shoulder, but he did not think anything was broken. Little Wolf cried out when they hit the ground, but he seemed to be okay. Jake looked up and saw the mother bear standing at the edge of the clearing. She was even bigger than Jake had remembered. The bear was looking at them with angry eyes, trying to decide what to do. Behind her, Jake could see 2 small cubs playing in the trees. Jake still had his rifle, but it had fallen a few feet away when they jumped. The bear was closer to the rifle than Jake was. If Jake tried to reach for the gun, the bear might attack. Instead, Jake did something that surprised even himself. He stood up slowly with Little Wolf still in his arms and started talking to the bear in a calm, quiet voice. "Easy, Mama Bear," Jake said softly. "We do not want to hurt you or your babies. We are leaving now. You can have your forest back." The bear tilted her huge head and listened to Jake's voice. Animals could not understand words, but they could understand the tone of a person's voice. Jake kept talking in the same calm way while he slowly backed away from the bear toward Buck. "We are going away now," Jake continued. "You do not need to fight us. Your babies are safe. Step by step, Jake moved backward across the clearing while the bear watched. Little Wolf held on tight and did not make any noise. The boy seemed to understand that they were still in danger. When Jake reached Buck, he very carefully lifted Little Wolf up onto the horse's back. The bear was still watching them, but she had not moved from the edge of the clearing. Jake untied Buck's rope and slowly climbed up behind Little Wolf. "We are leaving your forest now," Jake said to the bear one more time. Then he gently turned Buck around and rode away from the clearing at a slow walk. Jake did not look back until they were deep in the forest and far away from the bear. When he finally stopped Buck and looked behind them, the clearing was empty. The bear had gone back to her cubs. Jake and Little Wolf were safe, but now Jake had a new problem. He had a Native American child with him, and he did not know where the boy's family was or how to find them. In 1876, having a Native child could mean serious trouble for a white man. Some people would think Jake had kidnapped the boy. Others would think he was working with the tribes against the white settlers. But Jake had made his choice when he decided to save Little Wolf from the bear. Now he had to figure out how to get the boy safely back to his people, and he had to do it without getting both of them killed. Jake rode Buck slowly through the forest with Little Wolf sitting in front of him on the saddle. The boy was quiet now, but Jake could feel him shaking. The child had been through a terrible experience, and Jake knew he needed to get him somewhere safe as soon as possible. First, Jake wanted to get far away from the mother bear and her cubs. He rode Buck in a wide circle around the clearing where they had been, heading toward his cabin. But as they rode, Jake started thinking about what to do next. He could not just take Little Wolf to his cabin and keep him there. The boy had a family somewhere, and they were probably looking for him. After riding for about an hour, Jake stopped Buck near a small stream. He helped Little Wolf down from the horse and knelt beside him to check if the boy was hurt. Little Wolf's clothes were torn in a few places from climbing on the rocks, and he had a small cut on his left hand. But the worst injury was to his ankle. It was swollen and painful from when he had climbed up the rocks to escape the bear. Jake was not a doctor, but he had learned some things about treating injuries when he was a soldier. He took a clean cloth from his saddlebag and soaked it in the cold stream water. Then he gently wrapped it around Little Wolf's ankle to help with the swelling. Little Wolf watched Jake work and seemed to understand that the man was trying to help him. When Jake was finished, the boy pointed to his chest and said his name again in his own language. Then he pointed to Jake and tried to say Jake the way Jake had said it earlier. Jake smiled and nodded. It was not much, but it was a start. They could not talk to each other with words, but they were beginning to communicate. Jake gave Little Wolf some water from his canteen and a piece of dried beef from his supplies. The boy was very hungry and ate quickly. While Little Wolf ate, Jake looked around and tried to figure out where they were and which direction they should go. Jake had lived in this valley for 3 years, but he had never been this far into the forest before. He knew that the Blackfoot tribe had camped somewhere in the mountains to the east, but he did not know exactly where. He had seen smoke from their fires sometimes, but always from far away. Jake tried to ask Little Wolf where his family was. He pointed in different directions and looked at the boy's face to see if any direction seemed right. When Jake pointed toward the eastern mountains, Little Wolf's face became excited. He pointed the same way and said several words in his language. Jake nodded and helped Little Wolf back onto Buck. The eastern mountains were at least a day's ride away, maybe more. But Jake had made up his mind. He was going to take Little Wolf home to his people, no matter how long it took or how dangerous it might be. As they rode toward the mountains, Jake thought about what he was doing. He knew that most white people would think he was crazy. The Blackfoot and other tribes were considered enemies by the settlers and the army. There had been fights and raids on both sides. Some white people had been killed by native warriors, and many native people had been killed by soldiers and settlers. But Jake had been a soldier, and he knew that most of the stories people told about the savage Indians were not true. Yes, there had been fights and killings, but usually they happened because both sides were scared and angry. Most native people just wanted to live in peace and take care of their families, just like most white people did. Jake also thought about his own past. When he was a soldier, he had seen white men do terrible things to native people. He had seen villages burned and families torn apart. Jake had not been proud of everything he had been ordered to do in the army. Maybe helping Little Wolf was a way to make up for some of the bad things he had seen and done. They rode through the forest for several hours. Little Wolf seemed to know the way, and he pointed Jake in the right direction when they came to places where the trail split. The boy was getting stronger as the day went on, and he was not shaking with fear anymore. Late in the afternoon, they came to a high hill that gave them a good view of the land ahead. Jake could see smoke rising from several fires in a valley about 5 miles away. Little Wolf became very excited when he saw the smoke. He pointed toward it and said many words in his language. Jake understood. They had found Little Wolf's people, but now Jake had to make another difficult decision. Should he ride right into the native camp with Little Wolf? That could be very dangerous. The people in the camp might think Jake was an enemy who had captured their child. They might attack him before he had a chance to explain what had happened. On the other hand, Jake could not just leave Little Wolf somewhere and hope the boy could find his way home alone. The child's ankle was still hurt, and there were bears and other dangerous animals in the forest. Little Wolf might not make it home safely by himself. Jake decided to take the risk. He would ride into the camp with Little Wolf and hope that the boy could explain what had happened. It was dangerous, but it was the right thing to do. As they got closer to the native camp, Jake could see that it was bigger than he had expected. There were at least 50 large tents made of animal skins, and he could see many people moving around between them. Horses were grazing in a field near the camp, and children were playing by a stream. When they were still about half a mile from the camp, Jake saw riders coming toward them. There were 6 native warriors on horses, and they were riding fast. Jake's heart started beating faster, but he kept Buck moving toward the camp at a steady walk. The warriors surrounded Jake and Little Wolf, but they did not attack. Jake could see that their faces were worried and angry, but also confused. They were trying to figure out why a white man was riding into their territory with one of their children. Little Wolf started talking very fast in his own language. He pointed to Jake and then to himself, and he made gestures like he was telling a story. Jake could not understand the words, but he could tell that Little Wolf was explaining how Jake had saved him from the bear. One of the warriors, an older man with gray hair, listened carefully to Little Wolf's story. Then he rode his horse closer to Jake and looked into his eyes. The warrior's face was serious, but Jake did not see hatred there. He saw someone trying to decide whether Jake was telling the truth. The warrior said something to the other men, and they formed a group around Jake and Little Wolf. Then they all rode together toward the camp. Jake was not a prisoner exactly, but he was definitely being watched very carefully. As they entered the camp, people came out of their tents to see what was happening. Jake saw men, women, and children of all ages. Some of the faces looked angry or scared when they saw him. Others looked curious. But when they saw Little Wolf sitting safely in front of Jake on the horse, most of the angry faces became confused. Little Wolf called out to someone in the crowd, and Jake saw a woman run toward them. She was crying and reaching up toward Little Wolf. Jake realized this must be the boy's mother. Behind her came a tall, strong-looking man who was probably Little Wolf's father. Jake helped Little Wolf down from Buck, and the boy ran to his mother. She hugged him tight and cried with relief. Little Wolf's father came over and knelt down to check if his son was hurt. The man's face was full of worry and love. Little Wolf started telling his parents what had happened, pointing to Jake and making the same gestures he had made for the warriors. Jake sat on Buck and waited, not knowing what would happen next. He was one white man surrounded by 50 native families, and he had no idea if they would see him as a hero or an enemy. The whole camp had gathered around them now. Jake could feel many eyes watching him. Some people were talking quietly to each other, and Jake wished he could understand what they were saying. Were they planning to thank him or were they planning to kill him? Little Wolf's father stood up and walked over to Jake. He was a tall man with strong shoulders and intelligent eyes. He wore clothes decorated with beautiful beadwork, and Jake could tell he was an important person in the tribe. The man looked up at Jake for a long moment without saying anything. Jake looked back at him, trying to show respect but not fear. Then, to Jake's surprise, the man reached up and put his hand on Jake's leg in a gesture of friendship. The man said something in his own language, and then he tried to speak in English. His English was not perfect, but Jake could understand him. "You save my son," the man said slowly. "Little Wolf, tell me, you fight bear. Very big bear, you brave man." Jake climbed down from Buck and stood facing Little Wolf's father. "I am glad I could help," Jake said. "Your son is very brave too." He climbed high rocks to get away from the bear. The man nodded and smiled a little, Then he said something to the crowd of people around them. Jake heard Little Wolf's name several times, and he heard what sounded like the word for bear in their language. Little Wolf's mother came over to Jake and bowed her head to him. She said something in her language that Jake could tell was thank you. Then she took Jake's hand and pressed it between both of hers. Jake felt a warm feeling in his chest. These people were grateful to him for saving their child. It did not matter that he was white and they were Native American. It did not matter that their peoples were supposed to be enemies. What mattered was that a child was safe with his family again. Little Wolf's father made a gesture for Jake to follow him. Jake led Buck as they walked through the camp toward a large tent in the center. Jake reached his cabin just as the sun was coming up over the mountains. He was tired from riding all night, but he felt good about what he had done. Buck was tired too, and Jake took extra time to brush the horse down and give him fresh hay and water. The horse had carried them safely through a dangerous day and deserved to be taken care of well. After putting Buck in his pen, Jake checked on his cattle. They were all there, grazing peacefully in the morning sunshine. Everything at his ranch was exactly the same as when he had left the day before, but somehow Jake felt like a different person. Jake went inside his cabin and made breakfast. While he cooked eggs and coffee, he thought about the people he had met at the Blackfoot camp. He thought about Chief Running Bear's wise words and Little Wolf's brave smile. He thought about how wrong the stories were that people told about Native Americans in town. After eating, Jake decided to get some sleep. He had been awake for more than 24 hours and his body was exhausted. He lay down on his bed, still wearing his clothes, and he fell asleep almost immediately. Jake slept deeply for several hours. He dreamed about bears and horses and a little boy with dark eyes who called him a hero. When he woke up, the sun was high in the sky and it was already afternoon. Jake got up and looked out his window. Something felt strange, but he could not figure out what it was. Everything looked normal. His cattle were still grazing in their field. Buck was resting in his pen. The forest looked the same as always, but there was something different about the feeling in the air. Jake had learned to trust his instincts during his time as a soldier. When something felt wrong, it usually was wrong. Jake walked outside and looked around more carefully. The first thing he noticed was that his cattle seemed nervous. They were standing close together and looking toward the forest. Buck was also acting strange. The horse's ears were pointed forward and he was looking in the same direction as the cattle. Jake followed their gaze toward the tree line, but he could not see anything unusual. The forest looked quiet and peaceful, but animals could sense things that people could not. If his animals were nervous, there was probably a good reason. Jake went back inside and got his spyglass, a small telescope that he had kept from his army days. He stood on his front porch and used the spyglass to look carefully at the forest around his valley. At first, Jake saw nothing unusual. Trees, rocks, and shadows looked just like they always did. But then something caught his eye. High up on a ridge to the north, he saw what looked like a person on horseback. Jake focused the spyglass on that spot and saw that it was indeed a rider, sitting very still and watching his cabin. Jake moved the spyglass to look at other ridges around his valley. On the eastern ridge, he saw another rider, then another on a hill to the south. Jake's heart started beating. Faster as he realized what he was seeing, he was being watched from all directions. Jake spent the next hour using his spyglass to carefully study every hill and ridge around his property. What he saw made him more and more worried. There were riders everywhere, positioned all around his valley. They were far enough away that he could barely see them, but they were definitely there. Jake counted at least 20 riders that he could see clearly. But he was sure there were more hidden in the trees where he could not see them. Someone had surrounded his ranch and they were watching everything he did. But who were they and what did they want? Jake's first thought was that they might be soldiers. Maybe someone had seen him riding with Little Wolf and reported that he was working with the native tribes. In 1876, any white man who was friendly with Native Americans could be accused of being a traitor. But the more Jake watched the riders, the more he realized they were not soldiers. They were sitting on their horses in a way that looked more like Native American riders than cavalry soldiers, and they seemed to be waiting for something rather than preparing to attack. As the afternoon went on, Jake noticed something even more disturbing. The number of riders was growing. Every time he looked through his spyglass, he could see more people on the ridges around his valley. By evening, Jake estimated that there were at least 50 riders watching his cabin. Jake spent the night inside his cabin with his rifle ready, watching through his windows. He did not sleep at all. Every few hours he used his spyglass to check on the riders. They were still there, silent and patient, like they were waiting for morning. When the sun came up, Jake looked out his window and felt his blood turn cold. The ridges around his valley were covered with riders. There were not just 50 anymore. There were hundreds. Jake used his spyglass to count them as carefully as he could. On the north ridge, he counted about 70 riders. On the east ridge, another 80. On the south and west ridges, there were even more. In the trees between the ridges, Jake could see the shapes of more horses and riders. As he counted, Jake realized he was looking at one of the largest gatherings of Native American warriors he had ever seen. There had to be at least 400 warriors surrounding his cabin, maybe more. Jake's hands shook as he lowered the spyglass. He was one man with one rifle, completely surrounded by hundreds of warriors. If they wanted to attack him, he would have no chance at all. He could not fight that many people. He could not run away because they had him surrounded. He was trapped. But the strange thing was that the warriors were not attacking. They were just sitting on their horses, watching and waiting. Jake could not understand what they wanted or why they were there. All morning, Jake watched the warriors through his spyglass. They did not move closer to his cabin, but they did not go away either. They seemed to be waiting for something, but Jake had no idea what. Jake tried to think of reasons why so many warriors would surround his ranch. Maybe they were angry about something. Maybe they thought he had done something wrong. Maybe they were planning to attack all the white settlers in the area, and his cabin was just the first stop. But none of these ideas made sense. If the warriors wanted to attack, why were they waiting? Why didn't they just ride down and get it over with? And why were there so many of them? It would not take 400 warriors to attack one man in a cabin. Jake also noticed that the warriors were from different tribes. Through his spyglass, he could see different styles of clothing and different tribal symbols. This was not just the Blackfoot tribe that he had visited. This was warriors from several tribes working together. Getting different tribes to work together was very unusual. Most of the time, the tribes in this area did not get along with each other very well. For them to join together like this, something very important must be happening. As the day went on, Jake became more and more nervous. He checked his rifle again and again to make sure it was loaded and ready. He counted his bullets and realized he had enough for maybe 20 shots. Against 400 warriors, 20 bullets would not help him much. Jake also checked his food and water supplies. He had enough food in his cabin to last about a week if he was careful. He had a well outside, but he could not get to it without going outside where the warriors could see him. If this situation lasted very long, he would run out of water. By afternoon, Jake was starting to feel desperate. He had been trapped in his cabin for almost 24 hours, and the warriors showed no signs of leaving. He could not understand what they wanted, and he could not think of any way to escape. Jake tried to remember everything he had learned about Native American customs when he was a soldier. He knew that different tribes had different ways of doing things. Some tribes liked to attack at dawn. Others preferred to attack at night. Some tribes would surround an enemy and wait for them to surrender, but this did not feel like any military tactic Jake had learned about. The warriors were not acting like they were preparing for battle. They were acting like they were waiting for a ceremony or a meeting. As the sun started to go down, Jake saw something that made his heart pound even harder. One of the warriors on the north ridge was riding down toward his cabin. The warrior was alone and carrying what looked like a long pole with feathers on it. Jake grabbed his rifle and went to the window. He watched as the warrior rode slowly across his field toward the cabin. When the warrior was about 100 yards away, he stopped and planted the pole in the ground. Then he called out something in a loud voice that Jake could not understand. The warrior's voice echoed across the valley, and Jake heard answering calls from the other warriors on the ridges. Then the lone warrior turned his horse around and rode back toward the ridge. Jake used his spyglass to look at the pole the warrior had left. It was decorated with eagle feathers and what looked like painted symbols. Jake had seen similar poles before when he was a soldier. It was a message pole used by native tribes to communicate with their enemies, but Jake could not read the symbols, so he did not know what the message said. Was it a demand for surrender? Was it a declaration of war? Was it an invitation to come out and talk? Jake had no way of knowing, and that made him even more scared. He was surrounded by hundreds of warriors, and he could not even understand what they wanted from him. As darkness fell, Jake saw fires being lit on the ridges around his valley. The warriors were not going anywhere. They were settling in for another night of watching and waiting. Jake realized. Little Wolf's father led Jake toward the center of the camp where the largest tent stood. This tent was different from the others. It was bigger and decorated with beautiful paintings of animals and symbols. Jake could tell this was the home of someone very important in the tribe. As they walked, Jake noticed how the camp was organized. The tents were arranged in a large circle with the big tent in the middle. Families lived together in groups with their horses and belongings nearby. Children played between the tents while women worked on various tasks like preparing food and making clothes. Men sat in small groups talking and working on weapons and tools. The whole camp seemed peaceful and well organized. Jake had heard many stories about native camps being wild and dangerous places. But this looked like any other community where families were just trying to live their lives and take care of each other. Little Wolf ran ahead to the big tent and called out to someone inside. An old woman came out, and Jake could see right away that this was Little Wolf's grandmother. She had long gray hair and a face full of wrinkles, but her eyes were bright and sharp. When she saw Little Wolf, she cried out with joy and hugged him tight. Little Wolf started telling his grandmother the same story he had told everyone else. He pointed to Jake and made gestures about the bear and the rescue. The old woman listened carefully, looking at Jake with curious eyes. Then a man came out of the big tent who made Jake catch his breath. This man was clearly the chief of the tribe. He was tall and strong with long black hair that had some gray in it. He wore a beautiful leather shirt decorated with beads and feathers. Around his neck was a necklace made of bear claws and eagle feathers. His face was serious and intelligent, and his eyes seemed to see everything. Little Wolf ran to this man and started telling his story again. Jake realized this must be Little Wolf's grandfather, and the chief of the entire tribe. The man listened to Little Wolf's words, then looked carefully at Jake. His face showed no emotion, but Jake could tell he was thinking deeply about what he had heard. Little Wolf's father walked over to the chief and spoke quietly in their language. Jake caught the word for bear several times, and he heard his own name mentioned. The chief nodded and asked several questions. Little Wolf's father answered, pointing to Jake and making gestures. Then the chief did something unexpected. He walked directly to Jake and stopped right in front of him. The two men looked at each other for a long moment. Jake tried to show respect without looking weak. He had learned in the army that it was important to look chiefs and officers in the eye. The chief spoke to Jake in English. His English was much better than Little Wolf's father's English. "I am Chief Running Bear," he said in a deep, strong voice. "Little Wolf is my grandson. His father tells me you saved the boy from a big bear." "Yes, sir," Jake replied. "I found him trapped on some rocks with a mother bear below. I helped him get down and brought him home." "Why?" the chief asked. "Why did you help a native child?" "Your people and my people are not friends." Jake thought about this question. It was a good question, and the chief deserved an honest answer. "Because he was just a scared little boy," Jake said finally. "I could not ride away and let him die. It would not have been right." Chief Running Bear studied Jake's face as he spoke. Then the chief asked, "What is your name, white man?" "Jake Morrison," Jake answered. "I live alone in the valley to the west. I have a small ranch there." "Jake Morrison," the chief repeated. "I have heard this name. You are the one they call the Quiet Cowboy. You do not bother my people, and we do not bother you." Jake was surprised that the chief knew about him. "Yes, sir. I try to mind my own business and live in peace." The chief nodded. "But today you did not mind your own business. Today you risked your life for my grandson." Jake did not know what to say to that, so he just nodded. Chief Running Bear turned and spoke to the crowd of people who had gathered around them. Jake could not understand the words, but he could tell from the chief's tone that he was telling them something important about what Jake had done. When the chief finished speaking, something amazing happened. One by one, people from the tribe began to approach Jake. They touched his arm or his shoulder gently, and each person said something that Jake understood was, "Thank you," in their language. Old men, young women, children, warriors, they all came to show their gratitude. Little Wolf's grandmother came to Jake and took his face in her wrinkled hands. She looked into his eyes and spoke words that Jake could not understand, but her meaning was clear. She was blessing him and thanking him for saving her great-grandson. When everyone had spoken to Jake, Chief Running Bear raised his hand for silence. "Jake Morrison," the chief said, "you have done a great thing today. Little Wolf is very important to our tribe. He is my only grandson, and someday he will be chief after his father. By saving his life, you have saved the future of our people." Jake felt overwhelmed by these words. He had just tried to help a child in danger. He had not thought about anything bigger than that. "You will eat with us tonight," the chief continued. "You will be our honored guest. This is not something we do for white men very often, but you have earned this honor." Little Wolf's father stepped forward and spoke to Jake. "My name is Strong Eagle," he said. "You saved my son. My family owes you a debt we can never repay." "You don't owe me anything," Jake said. "I just did what anyone should do." Strong Eagle shook his head. "Not anyone would do what you did. Many white men would have ridden away. Some might even have hurt Little Wolf just because he is native. But you risked your life to save him." Chief Running Bear gestured toward the big tent. "Come, we will eat and talk. I want to know more about the man who saved my grandson." Jake followed the chief into the tent, which was even more impressive inside than outside. Beautiful rugs covered the ground, and the walls were decorated with painted designs and hanging weapons. A fire burned in the center of the tent, and the smoke went up through a hole in the top. The chief's family gathered around the fire. Little Wolf sat next to his grandfather, still excited about his adventure but safe and happy now. Little Wolf's parents sat nearby, and his grandmother bustled around preparing food. Soon other important men from the tribe joined them in the tent. Jake learned that these were the tribal elders and war leaders. They all wanted to hear the story of what had happened with the bear. Little Wolf told the story again, but this time his grandfather translated parts of it into English so Jake could understand. Jake was amazed at how accurate the boy's story was. Little Wolf remembered every detail, from the moment he surprised the bear while picking berries to the moment Jake helped him down from the rocks. When Little Wolf finished his story, one of the elders asked Jake to tell his version. Jake described what he had seen and done, trying to make it sound less dramatic than it really was. But the men around the fire understood the danger Jake had faced. "A mother grizzly with cubs," one elder said, shaking his head. "That is the most dangerous animal in the forest. Many warriors would not face such a bear to save a child." "The boy needed help," Jake said simply. "I could not leave him there." Chief Running Bear looked at Jake with new respect. "You are a good man, Jake Morrison. Tonight you are not a white man and we are not native people. Tonight we are just people sharing food and friendship." Little Wolf's grandmother served them a meal of roasted deer meat, corn, and wild berries. The food was delicious and Jake ate hungrily. He had not realized how tired and hungry he was after the long day. As they ate, the men talked about many things. They asked Jake about his life in the valley and his time as a soldier. They told him about their tribe's history and their hopes for the future. Jake learned that these people were not so different from white people. They worried about their children, they worked hard to provide for their families, and they wanted to live in peace. After the meal, Chief Running Bear gave Jake a beautiful blanket made of soft animal fur. "This is a gift from our family to yours," the chief said. "When you wrap yourself in this blanket, remember that you have friends among the Blackfoot people." Jake was deeply moved by the gift. "Thank you, Chief Running Bear. I will treasure this always." As the evening grew late, Jake knew he should start the journey back to his cabin. It would be a long ride in the dark, but he wanted to get home. The chief offered to let him stay the night in the camp, but Jake politely declined. "I should go home," Jake said. "My animals need to be fed in the morning." Chief Running Bear nodded with understanding. A man must take care of his responsibilities. The whole tribe gathered to say goodbye to Jake as he prepared to leave. Little Wolf hugged Jake's legs and said something in his language that his father translated. "He says you are his hero," Strong Eagle told Jake. "He wants to be brave like you when he grows up." Jake knelt down and looked into Little Wolf's eyes. "You are already very brave," he told the boy. "You climbed those rocks to escape the bear. That took great courage." As Jake rode Buck out of the camp, the people called out farewells in their language. Jake waved back, feeling warm inside despite the cold night air. He had come into the forest that morning to check his fence lines, and he was going home with new friends and a story he would never forget. Jake did not sleep at all during his second night surrounded by warriors. He sat by his window with his rifle across his knees, watching the fires on the ridges and wondering what would happen when morning came. Every sound made him jump. Every shadow looked like it might be a warrior sneaking closer to his cabin. When the first light of dawn appeared over the mountains, Jake felt his stomach tighten with fear. This was probably the day he would die. He had saved one native child, and now it looked like hundreds of native warriors had come to kill him. Jake could not understand why, but he was sure that was what was going to happen. As the sun rose higher, Jake used his spyglass to look at the warriors on the ridges. They were all awake and moving around, but they were not preparing for battle the way Jake expected. Instead, they seemed to be organizing themselves into some kind of formation. Then Jake saw something that made his heart beat even faster. A single rider was coming down from the north ridge, heading straight toward his cabin. This rider was different from the others. He was wearing a magnificent headdress with many eagle feathers, and he carried a long staff decorated with feathers and beads. Jake raised his rifle and aimed at the approaching rider through his window. But something made him hesitate. The rider was not charging toward the cabin like he was attacking. He was riding slowly and calmly like he was coming to visit a friend. When the rider got about 50 yards from the cabin, he stopped his horse and called out in a loud, clear voice. To Jake's amazement, the man was speaking English. "Jake Morrison," the rider called. "I am Chief Running Bear of the Blackfoot people. I come in peace. Put down your weapon and come outside. We need to talk." Jake's hands shook as he recognized the voice. It was Chief Running Bear, Little Wolf's grandfather. But why was he here with hundreds of warriors? Had Jake done something wrong when he visited the Blackfoot camp? "I know you are afraid," the chief called out. "But you have nothing to fear from us. Come outside, Jake Morrison. Come and hear what we have to say." Jake looked through his spyglass at the warriors on the ridges. They had not moved closer, and they did not seem to be preparing to attack. If they wanted to kill him, they could have done it already. Maybe the chief really did just want to talk. But Jake was still scared. He had never seen so many warriors in one place before. Even if they said they came in peace, 400 armed warriors was a terrifying sight. "Why are there so many warriors with you?" Jake called back through his window. "What do you want from me?" "Come outside and I will explain everything," Chief Running Bear replied. "But I will not shout our business across your field for everyone to hear. This is important, Jake Morrison. Trust me as I trusted you when you brought my grandson home." Jake thought about what the chief had said. It was true that Jake had been welcomed peacefully at the Blackfoot camp. Chief Running Bear had treated him with honor and respect. Maybe the chief really did just want to talk. But it was still terrifying to think about walking outside when surrounded by hundreds of warriors. If this was a trap, Jake would be dead the moment he stepped out of his cabin. Jake made his decision. He could not hide in his cabin forever. If the warriors wanted to kill him, they would find a way to do it whether he came outside or not. At least if he went outside, he might learn what this was all about before he died. Jake put down his rifle and walked to his door. His hands were shaking as he lifted the wooden bar that kept the door locked. He took a deep breath, said a quick prayer, and opened the door. The morning air was cold on Jake's face as he stepped outside his cabin. Chief Running Bear sat on his horse about 50 yards away, watching Jake with calm, serious eyes. The chief was wearing the most beautiful clothing Jake had ever seen. His shirt and pants were made of soft leather decorated with thousands of colorful beads. His headdress had at least 30 eagle feathers, and each feather was perfect. But what impressed Jake most was the dignity in the chief's face. This was clearly a man of great importance and wisdom. When Chief Running Bear spoke, people listened. "You are very brave, Jake Morrison," the chief said as Jake walked toward him. "It takes courage to come outside when you are surrounded by so many warriors." "I'm not feeling very brave right now," Jake admitted. "I'm scared. Why are all these warriors here? Have I done something wrong?" Chief Running Bear smiled slightly. "You have done nothing wrong. In fact, you have done something very right. That is why we are here." Jake stopped about 10 feet away from the chief's horse. He could feel hundreds of eyes watching him from the ridges around the valley. It was the most frightening feeling he had ever experienced. "I don't understand," Jake said. "Why would you bring so many warriors just to talk to me?" "Because this is not just about talking," Chief Running Bear replied. "This is about honor. This is about recognizing a debt that can never be repaid." The chief climbed down from his horse and walked over to Jake. Standing on the ground, the two men were about the same height. Chief Running Bear looked directly into Jake's eyes. "2 days ago, you saved the life of my grandson," the chief said. Little Wolf is not just any child. He is my only grandson. He is the future chief of our people. When you saved his life, you saved the future of the Blackfoot tribe. Jake nodded. I understand that Little Wolf is important to you, but I still don't understand why you brought an army to my ranch. Look around you, Jake Morrison, the chief said, gesturing toward the ridges. What you see is not an army. What you see is representatives from every tribe in this region. Blackfoot, Crow, Cheyenne, Arapaho, even tribes that do not usually get along with each other. Jake used his hand to shade his eyes as he looked at the warriors on the ridges. Now that the chief mentioned it, Jake could see that the warriors did look different from each other. They wore different styles of clothing and carried different kinds of weapons. Why are they all here? Jake asked. Because what you did has spread to every tribe in these mountains, Chief Running Bear explained. The story of the white man who risked his life to save a native child has been told around every campfire from here to the Canadian border. Jake felt overwhelmed. It's just a story. I just helped a kid who was in trouble. No, the chief said firmly. It is much more than that. In a time when white men and native people are killing each other, you chose to save a native child. You could have ridden away. Many white men would have ridden away. Some might even have hurt Little Wolf just because he was native, but you risked your life to save him. The chief paused and looked at Jake with deep respect. That makes you a very special person, Jake Morrison. That makes you someone who deserves to be honored. Jake was beginning to understand, but he was still confused. So you brought 400 warriors here to honor me? Not just to honor you, Chief Running Bear said. To make you one of us. Jake felt his knees go weak. What do you mean? I mean that today, if you accept, you will become a member of the Blackfoot tribe, the chief explained. You will be adopted as my own son. You will have all the rights and protections that come with being one of our people. Jake could not believe what he was hearing. But I'm white. I'm not Native American. Blood does not make a person, the chief said. Actions make a person. Your actions have shown us that you have the heart of a true warrior and the soul of a good man. That is what matters to us. The chief turned and gestured toward the warriors on the ridges. Every warrior you see came here to witness this ceremony. This has never been done before, Jake Morrison. No white man has ever been adopted into our tribe. But no white man has ever done what you did. Jake felt tears coming to his eyes. He had never imagined anything like this could happen. He had thought the warriors came to kill him, but instead they had come to honor him in the greatest way they knew how. What does this mean? Jake asked. What would happen if I accepted? It means you would be under the protection of every tribe represented here today, Chief Running Bear explained. It means you could travel safely through any of our territories. It means you would have a family among our people for the rest of your life. The chief's voice became more serious. But it also means you would have responsibilities. You would be expected to live with honor and to help your people when they need you. Jake looked around at the hundreds of warriors watching him. They had come from all over the region just to be part of this ceremony. It was the greatest honor Jake could imagine, but it was also frightening. What if I say no? Jake asked. Then you say no, the chief replied. No one will be angry with you. You will still have our gratitude for saving Little Wolf. But this opportunity will never come again. Jake thought about everything that had happened in the past few days. He thought about Little Wolf's scared face on top of the rocks. He thought about the peaceful evening he had spent with the Blackfoot families. He thought about how wrong he had been about Native people before he met them. What do I have to do? Jake asked. Chief Running Bear smiled. Just say yes. Jake looked one more time at the warriors surrounding his valley. Then he looked at Chief Running Bear's wise, kind face. Jake made his decision. Yes, he said. I accept your offer. Chief Running Bear's smile grew wider. Then he raised his staff high in the air and called out. When Chief Running Bear raised his staff and called out across the valley, something amazing happened. From every ridge and hill around Jake's ranch, warriors began riding down toward the cabin. They came slowly and with great dignity, forming a huge circle around Jake and the chief. Jake watched in wonder as hundreds of mounted warriors surrounded him. They were all different, representing many tribes from across the region. Some wore war paint in bright colors. Others had elaborate feathered headdresses. Their horses were painted with symbols and decorated with feathers and beads. As the warriors formed their circle, Jake noticed that they were arranged in a specific pattern. The older men and chiefs were closer to the center, while younger warriors formed the outer rings. Everyone had a place and everyone knew exactly where they belonged. When all the warriors were in position, Chief Running Bear spoke to Jake in English so he could understand what was happening. "Jake Morrison," the chief said in a loud voice that carried across the gathering, "you are about to receive the highest honor our people can give. You will be made a member of the Blackfoot tribe and given the sacred name Brother of the Bear." Jake felt shivers run down his spine when he heard the name. Brother of the Bear. It was a name that honored both his courage in facing the grizzly and his kinship with the people he had helped. Chief Running Bear continued speaking. "This name means that you face the most dangerous animal in the forest to save one of our children. It means you have the heart of a bear, fierce when protecting others but gentle with those who need help." Several other chiefs rode forward to join Chief Running Bear in the center of the circle. Jake recognized one of them as Strong Eagle, Little Wolf's father. The others were leaders from different tribes, each wearing the symbols of their people. One of the chiefs, an elderly man with completely gray hair, spoke to Jake in broken English. "I am Chief Gray Wolf of the Crow people," he said. "Our tribes, not always friends with Blackfoot. But today, we come together. Your brave heart brings peace between us." Another chief, a younger man with scars on his face, added, "I am Chief Thunderhorse of the Cheyenne. The story of what you did, it has traveled like wildfire through all our camps. Young warriors learn from your example." Jake was overwhelmed by the presence of so many important leaders. These were men whose names were known throughout the region, chiefs who commanded the respect of thousands of people, and they had all come here to honor him. Chief Running Bear raised his hand for silence, then began the adoption ceremony. He started by telling the gathered warriors the complete story of how Jake had saved a little wolf. He spoke in his own language, but Jake could follow parts of the story by the gestures the chief made. When Chief Running Bear reached the part about Jake facing the mother bear, many of the warriors made sounds of approval and amazement. Jake heard the word for bear repeated many times, and he saw warriors nodding their heads in respect. After telling the story, Chief Running Bear called for Little Wolf to come forward. The boy rode into the circle on a small painted pony, wearing beautiful new clothes made just for this ceremony. When Little Wolf saw Jake, his face lit up with joy. Little Wolf rode his pony right up to Jake and jumped down. The boy ran to Jake and hugged his legs just like he had done when Jake left the Blackfoot camp 2 nights ago. Then Little Wolf spoke to the gathering in his own language, telling his version of what Jake had done. When Little Wolf finished speaking, Chief Running Bear asked Jake to kneel on the ground. Jake did as he was asked, feeling the eyes of hundreds of warriors watching his every move. Chief Running Bear began painting symbols on Jake's face with red and black paint. As he painted, the chief explained what each symbol meant. "This red line across your forehead means courage," the chief said. "This black circle around each eye means you see clearly, even in danger. These red stripes on your cheeks mean you are a protector of children." When the face painting was finished, Chief Running Bear took an eagle feather from his own headdress and placed it in Jake's hair. "This feather belonged to my father and his father before him," the chief said. "It has been blessed by many generations of chiefs. Now it belongs to you." Next, Strong Eagle came forward carrying a beautiful necklace made of bear claws, eagle feathers, and turquoise beads. "This is the sacred necklace of the Bear Brotherhood," Strong Eagle explained as he placed it around Jake's neck. "Only 3 men in the history of our tribe have worn this necklace. Now you are the 4th. Jake felt the weight of the necklace on his chest and understood that he was receiving something incredibly precious and rare. This was not just jewelry. It was a symbol of belonging to something ancient and sacred. The ceremony continued with gifts from chiefs of other tribes. The Crow Chief gave Jake a war shirt made of soft elk hide and decorated with porcupine quills. The Cheyenne Chief presented him with a beautiful knife in a beaded sheath. Each gift came with words of welcome and respect. But the most meaningful part of the ceremony came when Chief Running Bear asked Jake to stand and face the gathered warriors. The chief placed his hands on Jake's shoulders and spoke to him with deep emotion. "Jake Morrison, who will now be known as Brother of the Bear," the chief said, "I adopt you as my own son. You are now a member of the Blackfoot tribe with all the rights and protections that come with that honor. But more than that, you are family." The chief's voice became even more serious as he continued. "This adoption means that every warrior here today pledges to protect you with their lives. It means that you can travel safely through any territory controlled by any of these tribes. It means that you have brothers and sisters among our people for as long as you live. Jake felt tears running down his cheeks as he listened to these words. He had lived alone for so long, thinking he had no family and no people who cared about him. Now suddenly, he had hundreds of brothers and sisters. Chief Running Bear turned to face the assembled warriors and called out in a loud voice. Jake could not understand all the words, but he could tell that the chief was asking the warriors to accept Jake as one of their own. The response was incredible. Every single warrior raised his weapon, spear, bow, rifle, or war club, high in the air and shouted their agreement. The sound of 400 voices shouting together echoed across the valley like thunder. Then one by one, each chief and elder came forward to touch Jake's hand or shoulder and speak words of welcome. It took more than an hour for everyone to greet their new brother. Jake tried to remember every face and every gesture, knowing that this was one of the most important moments of his life. When the formal greetings were finished, Chief Running Bear had one more surprise for Jake. He called out to someone in the crowd of warriors, and Jake saw an old woman riding forward on a beautiful white horse. Jake recognized her immediately. It was Little Wolf's grandmother, the wise old woman who had blessed him at the Blackfoot camp. She was carrying a large bundle wrapped in soft deerskin. The old woman climbed down from her horse with the help of 2 young warriors, then walked over to Jake. She unwrapped the bundle to reveal the most beautiful blanket Jake had ever seen. The blanket was made of the softest buffalo hide, painted with intricate designs in many colors. In the center was a painting of a man standing between a bear and a small child. Around the edges were symbols representing all the tribes that had participated in today's ceremony. This blanket tells your story. Brother of the Bear, Chief Running Bear translated as the old woman spoke. It was made by the women of our tribe working together for 2 days and 2 nights. It will keep you warm, but more importantly, it will remind you always that you have a place among our people. Little Wolf's grandmother placed the blanket around Jake's shoulders, then stepped back and smiled at him. Jake could see the love and respect in her old eyes, and he felt overwhelmed by the kindness these people were showing him. As the ceremony neared its end, Chief Running Bear made one final announcement to the gathered warriors. He spoke for several minutes in his own language, and Jake could tell from the reactions of the crowd that he was saying something very important. When the chief finished speaking, he turned to Jake and explained what he had said. I have told all the warriors here that they must spread the word about what happened today. Every tribe, every band, every family in this region must know that Jake Morrison, brother of the Bear, is under our protection. The chief's face became very serious. I have also told them that anyone who harms you will face the combined anger of all these tribes. That is a threat that no one in this region would dare to ignore. Jake understood the full meaning of what Chief Running Bear was saying. The adoption was not just ceremonial, it was also practical. Jake now had the protection of the most powerful alliance of tribes in the region. Anyone who wanted to hurt him would have to face hundreds of angry warriors. But Jake also understood that this protection came with responsibilities. What do you expect from me in return? He asked the chief. Live with honor, Chief Running Bear replied. Help others when they need help, just as you helped Little Wolf. Remember that you represent our people now, and act in a way that brings honor to the name Brother of the Bear. The chief paused, then added with a smile,